The medical literature is full of papers and journal articles calling Alzheimer's disease type 3 diabetes or diabetes of the brain. And where that comes from is that neurons in regions of the brain that get affected in this illness lose the ability to get energy from glucose. So essentially, they starve to death. I mean, this condition is essentially a fuel crisis. It's an energy crisis inside the brain.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Hilda Labrada Gore. This is episode 70, and my guest is Amy Berger. Amy is a certified nutrition specialist and nutritional therapy practitioner who has done some serious research on the topic of Alzheimer's. In today's conversation, we cover some of the ground from her latest book, The Alzheimer's Antidote. Many of us have friends or family who suffer with this disease. I have some friends who are just terrified that they're going to get it one day. Amy restores our hope as she helps us understand what's at the root of the disease and what first steps to take to help those with Alzheimer's. Before we dive into the episode, we want to thank our sponsors. Wise Traditions is supported in part by Real Milk, nature's perfect food. Visit realmilk.com. And listeners like you. Every review on iTunes, every share of an episode, every time you donate to the foundation, you help keep this podcast going. Thank you. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Amy.
Thanks. I'm very happy to be here.
I saw a video that went viral, I think, on Facebook about a woman, a physician named Mary Newport, whose husband had Alzheimer's. And she demonstrated on that video how he had improvement simply by her adding coconut oil to his diet. Do you know anything about that story?
I do. I've actually met Dr. Newport at some conferences. The story of her husband is really, really remarkable. Unfortunately, Mr. Newport has passed away, but, during his last couple of years, he was doing much better, at least with his symptoms and his memory and his personality, because Dr. Newport dug into the research and found some benefit to ketones, and we'll get into that later, but ketones come from certain types of fats, and they come from different metabolic processes in the body, but coconut oil is a very good source that readily gets converted into ketones in the body, and so she changed nothing else about his routine. She didn't change his diet. She didn't change anything about his lifestyle, just added the coconut oil just to see what would happen, and that alone, she noticed a remarkable improvement in him.
What were some of the changes?
Well, I think part of the video shows the clock, his ability to draw the clock, which is kind of like this informal test for Alzheimer's, is how well you can draw a clock. And with the coconut oil, there were, slight changes in his memory, in his cognition, in his ability to just respond to her. Over time, as she got more knowledgeable about how this all works, she was actually adding what we call exogenous ketones. And when his ketone level was much higher, he was significantly better. He was able to dress himself. He was able to participate in conversations. He self-reported. He said he felt better. He felt better able to do things. He could shave. Bathe himself. These were things that he had not been able to do for a very long time. The ketones did not reverse the disease process. He did still unfortunately lose his life, but at least in the short term, his quality of life and also her quality of life were much improved.
I think I saw a movie about a woman who got struck by Alzheimer's. What was the name of that movie? With Julianne Moore.
Oh, Still Alice or something like that. I'm not sure of the name.
Yeah. Still Alice. But so I saw this movie and it showed the degenerative nature of Alzheimer's, and it's just scary, isn't it?
It's very scary because there seems to be so much mystery about it, and it just seems to strike indiscriminately. We don't know who's going to get it, and at least for now, and in the mainstream, medical community, we are led to believe that there's nothing we can do about it. That it's just bad luck, essentially.
Mm-hmm. But what's your theory, Amy? What do you say about that?
Well, it's not really my theory. In the book that I wrote called The Alzheimer's Antidote, what I have tried to do is synthesize the medical literature. So this is the findings of PhDs and MDs and researchers that, eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff. I've tried to translate that stuff into plain English so that the loved ones and caregivers of people with this condition can actually put pertinent information into action. And so what I've found is the medical literature is full of papers and journal articles calling Alzheimer's disease type 3 diabetes or diabetes of the brain. And where that comes from is that neurons in regions of the brain that get affected in this illness lose the ability to get energy from glucose. So essentially, they starve to death. I mean, this condition is essentially a fuel crisis. It's an energy crisis inside the brain. I mean, that's the major thing going wrong. It is more complex than that. I'm simplifying, but there's also, the medical literature is very clear that there are numerous lifestyle and dietary habits that put us at risk for this illness. I don't think it strikes indiscriminately. There is a genetic risk factor for it, but not everyone with that genetic type gets this illness, and most people who actually get Alzheimer's do not have this genetic type. So the genetic type increases your susceptibility, but it doesn't guarantee that you'll get this illness.
So you're saying it's a kind of diabetes of the brain. That's a really fascinating way to look at it. I've never heard it referred to in those terms, but the literature you've read, it's all pointing to the fact that there is a fuel crisis. I love the way you describe that. Can you explain that a little more?
Sure. In scientific circles, they call this brain hypometabolism. Hypometabolism meaning too little fuel, too little metabolism is going on. It's not known for sure how this happens or why it happens. I mean, we could speculate, but the bottom line is that these neurons become unable to get energy from glucose. And glucose comes mostly from carbohydrate. We can get it through many other sources, but the primary source of glucose in the body is going to come from carbohydrates that we eat. Mm-hmm. And when the brain becomes unable to use glucose or to use it efficiently, that's a major problem because there's not another major fuel source that the brain can turn to in lieu of glucose, except when you have abundant ketones in your blood. Ketones are an alternative fuel for the brain. And not only are they an alternative fuel, we can think of them as almost like a clean burning fuel. Like if the brain were a hybrid car, this is electric as opposed to gasoline, where you're not polluting as much and you're not generating as much CO2 and all these toxic byproducts.
So ketones, can you tell us what those are exactly?
Sure. Ketones are a byproduct of metabolizing fat. When your body's breaking down fat at a relatively high rate and certain other substances are limited, specifically carbohydrate, some of the fat is metabolized into ketones. They're just another energy source, but they're not produced in high levels in the body unless insulin levels are very low. And in most people, because we eat a fairly high carbohydrate diet, our insulin levels are elevated all throughout the day. So it's only when you take deliberate measures to keep your insulin levels low, mostly by keeping carbohydrate intake very low, that your body will ramp up ketone production. And you can produce ketones other ways, like we said earlier, coconut oil. There's also MCT oil. These are special fats that are more readily converted into ketones so that even if somebody's eating a high carbohydrate diet, you can still get their ketone levels up if they consume a lot of coconut and MCT oil.
So all the literature you read indicates that these ketones will help almost give another source of fuel to the brain, correct?
Absolutely. So it's really fascinating. In the Alzheimer's brain, even though the capacity to use glucose efficiently is impaired, the ability to use ketones is not impaired. Now, an aging brain, an Alzheimer's brain, might have a lower capacity to use ketones than a healthy young person, but they can still use them. And we know they can still use them because many, many clinical trials have shown that when you get people's ketone levels up, their cognition is noticeably improved. It doesn't work in everybody, but most people will have some degree of improvement.
What about medication? I've heard of many people who are Alzheimer's patients or who have issues with dementia who are put on medications like Namenda to slow the progress of their loss of cognitive ability. Do the ketones work in the same way?
Really good question. Most of the medication for Alzheimer's is ineffective. It has a very, very tiny improvement effect at best, if that. Most of the drugs have actually been complete failures. So the ketones work in the short term. When your body's ketone level is elevated, the brain now has access to this fuel. But once that's gone, it's gone. So the ketone bodies themselves don't really do anything to actually retard or address the disease process. Whereas I think if you are on the type of diet that generates ketones 24/7, even a low level, because the type of diet that would do that, I think, would go at least some way toward undoing some of the metabolic damage that is causing this in the first place. Now, I'm speculating. I mean, the research is in its infancy, but based on the biochemical mechanisms at work, I do think that, a very low carb, higher fat diet to feed these starving neurons, it's anti-inflammatory. There's less oxidative stress. Ketones are a much more efficient fuel. If the primary problem is, I mean, we kind of skipped over this, but there's a huge role of insulin here, and we've got to get insulin lower. And the way to do that is a low carb diet. So the ketones themselves are very powerful. If somebody can get their hands on an exogenous ketone product, which is almost like a ketone supplement, that will improve cognition and behavior in the short term. But I think the way to actually make inroads toward reversing the damage instead of just managing the symptoms is to do more of a ketogenic diet and other lifestyle interventions too, but the diet would be the place to start.
Well, this is really revolutionary talk because I've never heard anyone say that there's a way to reverse Alzheimer's.
Well, it is in its infancy. I want people to know this is not a sure thing, but the alternative is there is no alternative. The standard of care for this disease is get your affairs in order, good luck. There's no standard of care. There's nothing to help. Like, people literally have nothing to lose when if the bottom line is that these brain cells are starving for fuel, let's give them an alternative fuel, one they can use. Like, bottom line, that's the number one place to start. Then we worry about all these other tweaks. And there's a doctor named Dale Bredesen who has a really, really fascinating program. He's done some small scale trials that they are now expanding, where his protocol has reversed mild Alzheimer's disease and cognitive impairment. And these are people who had to quit their jobs, people who were unable to work because of their dementia. It was becoming so severe. And these people are now back at work. People that had lost the ability to really go about their daily lives. And his protocol is not a ketogenic diet, but it is a low glycemic diet. It's slightly higher fat, lots of micronutrient repletion. So he does a significant amount of testing if, people's vitamin and mineral status, thyroid hormone, testosterone, many other hormones, and he optimizes everything. And these people basically come back to life. I mean, it's like somebody turns the lights on.
That's amazing. So why am I not seeing this on the news? Like, why are people not hearing about this?
Well, I think part of it is his studies are very small, but they have to be. You have to start somewhere. What we need now is for more and more people to do this. And Dr. Bredesen is actually training people all over the country in his protocol. So I think we will start to see it. Part of it, I think we may not be seeing it because it's not easy. It's a complicated protocol. It's more than just take this pill, or it's more than even just change your diet. It's a very multifactorial system. It involves getting better sleep, stress reduction, exercise. I mean, it's a huge program. But I also think we're probably not hearing about it because people don't believe it. It's very hard for people to even believe that somebody has actually reversed this condition or even improved it significantly at all. It's just very hard for the general public and even medical professionals to wrap their heads around the fact that you could actually make a huge dent in this disease without pharmaceutical drugs.
Wow, that is fantastic. I love this. And of course, you're talking to someone who embraces the Wise Tradition diet, who believes that food can be our medicine. And essentially, that's what some of this protocol includes.
Oh, definitely. Bredesen's protocol is probably not as high fat as the one I would recommend, but certainly I recommend one that is full of the traditional nourishing, the nourishing fats, as Sally Fallon would call them, beef tallow, especially for the brain, egg yolks, butter, coconut oil, liver. There's nothing better for somebody with cognitive impairment than those kind of foods.
Mm-hmm. And basically, we're feeding the brain that is starving to death.
Exactly.
Coming up, Amy talks to us about how dietary changes may help us prevent getting Alzheimer's in the first place. She also discusses how some of her clients who do not have Alzheimer's find relief from brain fog when they make certain dietary changes. We pause now to thank our sponsors. Real Milk. Pasture-fed, unprocessed, full-fat, nature's perfect food. Find out about the benefits of real raw milk and where you can obtain it at realmilk.com. And listeners like you. Lauren from Body and Soul had this to say on Libsyn. Thank you for desiring to help people to be more educated on how to make better food choices that lead to a healthier life. I am trying to incorporate real foods into my and my family's lives, but it is so hard for me to stay committed. This podcast is a revamp on my desire to push on in the direction I want my family to go. Thank you. It's our pleasure, Lauren. Keep up the good work and keep listening. So this diet sounds amazing, and as I said a moment ago, in keeping with the Wise Traditions diet. Do you think that would also help with people who want to prevent getting the disease in the first place?
I do. I do think it can potentially be preventive, but I don't think a very low carbohydrate diet is required to prevent this. What is required is keeping blood glucose and insulin levels within a healthy range. I think this condition is being driven largely by hyperinsulinemia, which is just a big fancy word for meaning that your insulin is too high too often. I think that's what's primarily causing these neurons to not want to use glucose anymore. So some people will be able to eat potatoes and beans and rice and grain and still have healthy glucose and insulin, but many of us can't. Many of us, we just are not as tolerant of carbohydrate as others. If you are going to eat carbohydrate, I do think it's best to do some of the starchy tubers. They're even a little more nutrient dense than the grains, things like beets and parsnips and sweet potatoes. But, if you are going to eat grains, try to prepare them according to the Weston Price Foundation's guidelines with soaking or sprouting or fermenting. Mm-hmm. But, if you find that your blood sugar is going very high after you eat those kind of things, and you can measure this at home with a home glucometer, then that might point you to the fact that you do best with a little bit lower carb. So I don't think you have to eat low carb in order to prevent this illness, but once this illness has already taken hold, once somebody gets to the point where their brain is not metabolizing glucose well, then it does no good to keep feeding them sources of glucose.
Got it. So are medical professionals, those who are not following this protocol that you mentioned earlier, but are still interested in helping Alzheimer's patients, are they getting the idea that diet needs to be a part of this treatment?
I don't know if the word is spreading yet. I think it will. I don't think we're there yet. I think it's going to take a long time for doctors to wrap their heads around just how important diet is, not just for Alzheimer's, but for any chronic condition.
No, it's true. Doctors are not trained in nutrition, right? They see an Alzheimer's patient, they write out the prescription and say, this is the best we can do.
Right. And that's really sad because that's not so best. I would say it's not so good. It's not so best. I mean, like I said before, there are a lot of unanswered questions, and I'm not trying to oversimplify this or make people sound like a low-carb, high-fat ketogenic diet is a miracle cure for this disease. It's not. It is the best, most promising, highest potential intervention we have at this time, in my opinion. For me, when you see that the fundamental problem in this condition is that these brain cells are starving, then automatically we should give them a fuel that they are able to use and go from there. And I don't even know, to me, that should be the standard of care immediately. And then let's tweak some of the other things that might be at work. And is that going to work for everybody? I don't know, but that's the place to start. And I really don't know why we're not already starting there.
Yeah, as you said earlier, there's nothing to lose. Because if the best the doctors can say is, we'll try to slow down the progress, but there's no way to stay it completely or reverse it, well, then you've got nothing to lose by modifying the diet. And perhaps like Mary's husband, people will see improvement.
Yeah, and I think, we're not sure if somebody of very advanced age and very severe disease process, we don't know if that can be reversed. I think it can be slowed perhaps. And like I said, with these ketones, at least in the short term, the symptoms can be better, which improves quality of life for the patient and their caregivers. And I think there's something to that. Even if we can't reverse this disease in somebody, we can throw them in a home and let them do as they may, or we can at least try to make their final years more pleasant. Mm-hmm. I don't mean to be defeatist, but I don't want to give people false hope. I mean, this is not a slam dunk, and it's very complicated. And even to get somebody with dementia to change their diet, it's a tall order. It's a tall order to get them to do anything that they don't want to do, right? They're belligerent, they're confused. It's very hard. So at the very least, if somebody prepares food for an Alzheimer's sufferer, load it up with coconut oil. Like if you do nothing else, start there.
Wow, that's great. And have you had the opportunity to do that, Amy?
Unfortunately, nobody has come to me yet, but hopefully with the book out, word will get out and some people will approach me for help. But I've not done it with Alzheimer's patients, but people who go on a low carbohydrate diet, especially if they transition to a very low carb diet from having eaten a very high carbohydrate junk, modern Western type diet, one of the first things they report is remission of brain fog. If they had brain fog or fuzzy thinking or even like just poor memory, they feel like somebody turned the lights on. They feel like someone has cleared the cobwebs out of their brain. And that has nothing to do with the weight loss or with other effects of this diet. It's because the brain is now getting this premier fuel of ketones. Mm-hmm. So if somebody who's already, relatively healthy, relatively young notices a difference, what kind of difference might we feel in someone who's really far gone that's finally getting a brain fuel they can use?
Mm-hmm. And is that how you eat?
I do eat low carb. I don't aim to be ketogenic all the time, but I think it happens in and out by default. I'm not a saint. I do have my treats. I have my chocolate, but I try to keep it to a minimum. But I definitely eat a lot of, I do eat a lot of coconut oil, eggs, red meat with lots of fat on it. So I do not fear the fat.
Well, and it sounds delicious too, actually.
Who wouldn't want to go on a quote unquote diet where you have to eat pork chops and steak?
Yeah, no, it sounds amazing. Yeah. So tell me, in addition to changing the diet and including more of these ketones, what other lifestyle changes are recommended in some of the treatment of Alzheimer's?
Well, one of them is exercise, and it shouldn't really be a surprise. I mean, that phrase diet and exercise, it's cliched, but it's cliched because it's kind of true. These things really are important. Exercise in terms of Alzheimer's or cognitive decline, I think is important for a couple of reasons. The first being it's really good for insulin sensitivity and blood glucose regulation. If you are active and you stay active into your old age to whatever extent you can, your insulin dynamics and the way your body handles glucose will be much improved. So that's a huge boon to Alzheimer's. And then the second thing is exercise increases something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which I was talking to a doctor yesterday, and he had the greatest phrase. He said BDNF is like miracle grow for your neurons. So if you can increase this compound in your brain, you can actually regenerate or even sort of bring back to life some of these neurons that were struggling. So definitely a role for exercise. And if somebody has severe dementia and it's not safe for them to exercise or they're not physically capable of exercise, I do think the diet alone should go a long way toward improving their symptoms. Exercise is just a bonus to add on top of that in the people who can do it. Other than that, sleep is really important. A lot of people with Alzheimer's disease have disrupted sleep or disrupted circadian rhythm. They have a hard time telling time even by the daylight. They have a hard time falling asleep or staying asleep. And it's kind of a chicken or egg, is disrupted sleep contributing to this disease, or once you have the disease, do you have trouble sleeping? And it seems to be a little bit of both. We sort of know the last couple of decades, as this disease has gotten worse, people are sleeping less. We're sleeping with lights on. We're sleeping with, we're up till all hours staring at these gadgets, and then we go to sleep. So I think it's feeding into it, and it's both. So anything you can do to get good quality and quantity of sleep. And also, getting good sleep improves insulin sensitivity. I know it sounds weird, but sleep really is important for metabolic health. So it's kind of multifactorial the way that all works. And Dr. Bredesen's program also involves meditation or some form of stress reduction, whether it's yoga or Pilates or some type of activity that helps somebody calm down and get into a more meditative state. It's hard to quantify the role that stress might be playing in this illness, but stress, high cortisol levels, chronically high stress also interferes with blood glucose and insulin regulation. So I think it all feeds in, which is why all of these are part of the intervention. But I do want to emphasize again, I think the diet is the most important and most powerful place to start, because there will be people who are severely demented that cannot do some of these other things. And if somebody's preparing food for them, then at the least they can change the diet.
Wow, that's just phenomenal. Thank you for all that information. I feel like if any of us followed all those lifestyle recommendations, we would be the better for it.
I think so. And it's there's hope. There's hope. You know, we're told for so long that this disease, there's no rhyme or reason to it. There's nothing you can do. And I just don't think that's true. And I think it's starting to come to light now that it's not true.
Wow, that's great. So I want to ask you this question, though you may have answered it earlier, but we'll see. If the listener could only do one thing to improve their health, what would you recommend that they do?
I would probably say manage your blood sugar. And that's a more general rule because there's a lot of things you could do to do that. So by saying manage your blood sugar, that means eat within your carbohydrate tolerance, do some exercise, get some sleep. It kind of encompasses all the things that might be necessary to do that. You know, and again, I don't want to scare people into thinking that they need to avoid potatoes or rice or, you know, properly prepared grains. There are people who can tolerate those things and they're fine, but a lot of us can't.
Well, Amy, thank you for your time today. This is invaluable information. I can't wait for it to get out there.
Thank you. And I want to thank you and also thank Sally Fallon and Dr. Stephanie Seneff. They helped me get my article published in one of the Wise Traditions journals a couple of years ago. And that was kind of the snowball that started this avalanche that is now this book. So I'm really grateful that they gave me that opportunity to get this information out there early.
Wonderful.
Thanks so much.
My guest today was Amy Berger. She has a blog where you can read about a wide range of nutrition topics, tuitnutrition.com. That's tuit, T-U-I-T, nutrition.com. And for highlights of this conversation and pertinent links to her blog and to her book, The Alzheimer's Antidote, just go to the westinaprice.org website, click on the tab Blogs and Podcasts to find the podcast page. And when you get there, look for the show notes for episode 70. Hey, and a quick shout out to the team at Podcast Village. They have contributed significantly to the quality of our sound and the speed of our production. Thanks especially to Charlie and Sarah for your invaluable podcasting audio and editing skills. Check them out at podcastvillage.com.
Have you been enjoying these podcasts? Have you benefited from them or from the resources on the website or local chapter meetings? If so, please become a member of the Weston A. Price Foundation. It's only $25 for students and seniors and $40 for a general membership. Your contribution is critical for the continued work of the foundation. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. The content of this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for medical advice.